Hey folks, welcome to this channel where forgotten struggles, untold sacrifices, and the voices of those who changed the world come alive again. Today, we journey through one of the most powerful revolutions in human history, the American women's suffrage movement. A story that began not with armies or gunfire, but with a simple question whispered in a small chapel in Seneca Falls. Why can't women vote? From that moment, a fire was lit, carried by countless women who marched through rain and riot, who wrote by candlelight when the world slept, who were mocked, jailed, force-fed, silenced yet never stopped. This is the story of Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Sojourner Truth, Ida B. Wells, Alice Paul, Carrie Chapman Catt, and thousands of unnamed women who refused to accept impossible. This history spans 170-plus years, from the first convention in 1848, through protest, division, hunger strikes, and sacrifice, to the 19th Amendment in 1920, to the civil rights movement, feminism waves, and digital activism today. It is not just history, it is the story of courage, equality, and the fight to be heard. If you have ever cast a vote, led a discussion, made a decision for yourself, then you are standing on the shoulders of those who fought before you. Stay with us, because what you are about to hear is not only the past, it is the reason the present exists. Welcome to the journey. Welcome to this channel. The story of the American women's suffrage movement is not simply a tale about a constitutional amendment or a political struggle. It is a story of voices that refused to be silenced, of women who stood against ridicule, law, custom, and even their own loved ones to demand one simple right: the right to be recognized as citizens with full political power. In early 19th century America, society believed that a woman's world was limited to the home: cooking, sewing, raising children, and maintaining moral virtue. A woman could not vote, could not hold property in many states if married, could not attend most universities, and in many cases could not speak publicly without being mocked. The country that spoke of freedom and democracy denied half its population any role in shaping it. Yet change was brewing. As abolitionist movements rose to challenge slavery, many women joined the cause, discovering their own voices in public activism. But these same women often found themselves restricted even within reform organizations, asked to organize events but not speak, to write but not lead. Such contradictions lit a spark inside figures like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, who realized that women's equality could not simply be hoped for, it must be fought for. The early suffrage pioneers faced a country shaped by patriarchal laws and deeply ingrained customs, but they also inherited a revolutionary spirit, the idea that rights are not granted, they are claimed. Their journey began long before organized conventions existed, in parlors where women whispered about change, in letters exchanged between reformers, in church basements where they discussed liberty, and in the quiet frustration of thousands who felt unseen. The movement did not begin with marches, but with questions. Why must a woman obey laws she had no voice in creating? Why must she pay taxes without representation? Why should her intelligence matter less simply because of gender? These questions became seeds that would soon grow into a nationwide call for justice. By the 1820s and 1830s, America was transforming, expanding westward, industrializing, debating morality and rights. Women entered factories, taught in schools, managed farms while men traveled for work, and participated in reform organizations, quietly proving their capability. Yet the law remained stubborn. A married woman legally merged with her husband under coverture, losing her identity in his. She could not own wages she earned, could not sign contracts, and even her children legally belonged to the father. Newspapers joked that women wanting rights was unnatural, even laughable. Still, beneath societal expectations, dissatisfaction was growing. Women who attended abolition meetings found strength in community, discovering that shared struggle created courage. They met Black organizers like Sojourner Truth and Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who understood both racial and gender oppression. The idea of women's rights was whispered in abolition halls, fueled by the belief that injustice anywhere must be challenged. When reformers Mott and Stanton traveled to London in 1840 as delegates to the World Anti-Slavery Convention, they were forced to sit behind a curtain, forbidden to participate because they were women. This humiliation burned into their memory. They spoke privately about creating a movement for women's rights when they returned home. What happened in London was a turning point. The fight for women's suffrage was no longer theoretical. It became personal, painful, urgent. Women now saw clearly what society thought of them. Even within progressive spaces, they were second class. Their anger became motivation. Back home, conversations spread. Pamphlets circulated arguing that democracy could not be true while women were excluded. Newspapers slowly began to print letters demanding legal reform, though often mocking them. Many men dismissed the idea as absurd. Women voting? Who will cook? Who will raise children? But ideas, once planted, cannot be unthought. A storm was building, and soon the nation would feel it. As the 1840s advanced, women reformers began to network, building alliances across abolition, temperance, education, and labor movements. These connections were the veins through which the lifeblood of suffrage activism flowed. Meetings in parlors evolved into organized discussions about legal inequality. Women studied law texts, debated strategy, and compared their lack of rights to the grievances listed in the Declaration of Independence. They realized something profound. America had been founded on the principle of consent of the governed, yet women, who made up half the governed, had no consent at all. Intellectual leaders like Margaret Fuller wrote essays challenging the assumption of female inferiority, arguing that women were capable of intellectual greatness if only given opportunity. Others focused on legal reform, property rights, and divorce laws. Meanwhile, the idea of a women's rights convention began to take shape. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, living in Seneca Falls, New York, became restless. Despite being a mother of several children, she refused to confine her ambition to domesticity. With support from Mott and other reformers, Stanton planned a public meeting, an act both radical and risky. Women speaking publicly about rights risked social ostracism and harassment. Yet courage often grows in the shadow of oppression, and plans moved forward. The announcement of the upcoming convention shocked many residents, some laughing at the idea that women thought they deserved rights. Still, news spread rapidly, attracting both supporters and critics. When July 1848 arrived, history was ready. The stage was set for an event that would ignite the suffrage movement formally. Before the doors opened, reformers drafted a document modeled after the Declaration of Independence, the Declaration of Sentiments, boldly declaring that all men and women are created equal. It listed grievances such as women's exclusion from voting, education, property rights, and public life. Signing it would be an act of defiance, a pledge to challenge the nation's conscience. No one present knew it yet, but this would be the beginning of a 72-year battle that would ultimately reshape America. The seed planted in Seneca Falls would grow into marches, arrests, hunger strikes, and a constitutional amendment. A revolution had begun. When July 19, 1848, arrived, the small town of Seneca Falls, New York, found itself at the center of a quiet revolution. The Wesleyan Chapel, a modest building, became the unlikely birthplace of America's organized fight for women's rights. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Martha Wright, Mary Ann McClintock, and Jane Hunt, 5 women who dared to challenge society, sent out a public notice calling for a convention to discuss the social, civil, and religious rights of women. The idea seemed astonishing to many. For most Americans, the notion that women could hold independent political thought was laughable. Newspapers advertised the upcoming convention, some with curiosity, others with ridicule. Yet people came. On the first day, the hall filled primarily with women, but the second day opened to men as well. Some arrived in support, others out of skepticism or simply to witness what they considered outrageous behavior. Stanton stood before them resolute, knowing that change never begins comfortably. She presented a document known as the Declaration of Sentiments, drafted closely after the style and language of the Declaration of Independence. Its boldest line, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal," echoed through the chamber, carrying a daring message. She listed grievances: women's exclusion from the vote, unequal property laws, lack of higher education, restrictions on divorce, limited job opportunities, and repression by religious doctrine. The audience reacted with surprise and debate. For many women present, these truths stirred emotions long buried beneath obedience and silence. They saw their daily struggles reflected in words powerful enough to challenge a nation. The convention became more than a meeting. It became a spark, lighting torches that generations would carry forward. More than 300 people attended that first gathering, an impressive number considering the controversy surrounding it. They discussed resolutions, debated personal freedoms, and confronted deeply held beliefs. Some resolutions passed easily, but one proposal, women's right to vote, caused an uproar even among supporters. Many believed demanding the ballot was too extreme and would damage the credibility of the movement. Yet Stanton insisted that without the vote, women could change nothing else. Rights meant little without political power. The room grew tense. Voices rose. Hesitation filled the air. At that moment, the movement found an unexpected ally. Frederick Douglass, a formerly enslaved man, writer, and leading abolitionist who attended the convention. Douglass rose to speak with calm conviction. He argued that justice and democracy must extend to all humans, regardless of color or gender. He reminded the audience that denying women the vote violated the principles America claimed to cherish. His words carried authority, shaped by his own experience fighting for the freedom of Black Americans. The room listened, and slowly the resistance softened. With Douglass' support, the resolution for women's suffrage passed. It was a triumph, though controversial beyond the chapel walls. In the days that followed, 100 brave attendees, 68 women and 32 men, signed the Declaration of Sentiments. Their names became a permanent mark in the history of equality, though many would later face backlash. Newspapers mocked the proceedings, calling them absurd. One editorial sneered that women were rebels seeking to abandon their homes and families. Another claimed that petticoat government would destroy the natural order. Ministers preached sermons warning that God intended women to be subordinate. Some women who signed the Declaration even withdrew their signatures later under social pressure, losing business, friends, and reputation. Still, the movement lived on. The press that mocked them also spread their message far beyond Seneca Falls. People who had never before considered women's rights now debated them. The idea spread like wildfire. Within weeks and months, suffrage discussions appeared in towns and parlors across the country. Conferences soon followed in Rochester, Worcester, and other cities. Stanton and Mott became leading figures, encouraging women to speak publicly, an act considered shocking but increasingly necessary. Susan B. Anthony would join their fight in a few years, forming a partnership with Stanton that would shape the struggle for decades. Together, they would lobby politicians, gather signatures, organize conventions, and endure arrest for daring to vote. The Seneca Falls Convention did not win women the ballot, but it built the foundation of the movement. It transformed frustration into action and private grievances into public demands. What began as a local meeting became the opening chapter of a 72-year battle that would not end until 1920. The nation had been challenged, and the echo of Seneca Falls would continue to grow, rattling the pillars of law, churches, and social customs for generations. After Seneca Falls, momentum gathered slowly but steadily. The signers of the Declaration became organizers, lecturers, and activists. They traveled by wagon and rail, often speaking to hostile crowds. It was common for hecklers to shout insults during speeches, throw vegetables, or accuse suffragists of abandoning their duties as wives and mothers. Yet many women balanced activism with family responsibilities, proving that ambition and domestic life could coexist. Attendance grew, but still the movement lacked national unity. The coming Civil War would soon complicate everything. When the war began in 1861, both Anthony and Stanton faced a devastating question. Should they continue fighting for women's suffrage while the nation fought for slavery's abolition? Many abolitionists asked them to pause their cause for the sake of national unity. Anthony agreed that slavery must end, but she also knew every delay for women meant more decades of waiting. Still, she and Stanton supported the Union effort, but refused to disappear. After the war, the passing of the 13th Amendment ended slavery, but the 14th and 15th Amendments sparked conflict. The 14th Amendment introduced the word male into the Constitution for the first time, specifying voting rights for men. The 15th Amendment granted black men the right to vote, but excluded women entirely. Anthony and Stanton were furious. They had fought alongside abolitionists for decades, only to watch men gain rights that women were still denied. They believed suffrage should be universal, regardless of race or sex. But divisions formed. Some activists supported the 15th Amendment, believing black male suffrage must come first and women would follow later. Others insisted rights could not be split, they should be equal for all at once. These debates fractured the movement into rival groups. In 1869, Stanton and Anthony formed the National Woman Suffrage Association, NWSA, focusing on a federal amendment for women. Lucy Stone and others formed the American Woman Suffrage Association, AWSA, favoring a state-by-state approach and supporting the 15th Amendment. Unity broke and progress slowed. Still, Anthony pressed forward. She wrote letters, planned conventions, and traveled endlessly. In 1872, she took an audacious step that changed history. She would vote illegally. The election of 1872 became a defining moment not only for Susan B. Anthony, but for the entire suffrage movement. Determined to challenge the Constitution directly, she entered a polling station in Rochester, New York, with several other women and demanded a ballot. The officials hesitated, uncertain whether to block her or allow her. Anthony argued her rights as a citizen under the 14th Amendment, declaring that voting was a privilege belonging to all citizens, not only men. After heated discussion, the inspectors let her vote. News spread quickly, shocking the nation. Newspapers erupted with commentary, some praising her bravery, most mocking or condemning. Days later, authorities arrested her. When the officer arrived at her home and asked her to come with him, Anthony famously responded, "I will never pay $1 of your unjust penalty." She refused to obey passively. During her trial in 1873, she turned the courtroom into a stage for suffrage. She delivered a powerful speech, calling her prosecution an example of tyranny. Her words echoed through history. Are women persons? If we are, then we must have the same rights as all persons. The judge, fearful of her influence, directed the jury to find her guilty without debate. She was fined $100, a fine she proudly never paid. Though she could not appeal, the trial made her a national symbol. Women saw courage in Anthony's defiance. Girls in schools learned her name. Even newspapers that ridiculed her kept her story alive. Her civil disobedience breathed new energy into the movement, inspiring activists across states to organize suffrage campaigns. During this period, suffrage struggled to gain traction in the East, where tradition was strong and political power deeply entrenched. But in the vast and evolving American West, possibilities emerged. Frontier life demanded practicality. Women worked alongside men to build homes, run farms, teach, and even defend communities. Equality was not merely ideology, it was necessity. In these rugged lands, the idea that women could vote did not seem shocking. It seemed reasonable. The first major breakthrough came from an unexpected place. Wyoming Territory, which in 1869 granted full voting rights to women, becoming the first government in the world to do so on equal terms with men. The decision stunned America. Some claimed Wyoming officials only did it to attract more settlers. Others argued it was a political experiment. Whatever the reason, women in Wyoming proved themselves capable, voting in elections, serving on juries, and even holding public office. Their participation did not destroy society, as critics predicted. Instead, it strengthened communities. Newspapers were forced to reconsider their mockery. If women could vote in Wyoming, then why not elsewhere? Soon after, Utah Territory followed in 1870, granting women voting rights as well. These victories thrilled suffragists. For the first time, the movement had living proof that women's suffrage could function in the real world, not just in theory. When anti-suffragists argued that women lacked political judgment, activists pointed to Wyoming women casting ballots with dignity and seriousness. But progress was never linear. In 1887, the federal government revoked Utah women's voting rights due to tensions with the Mormon Church, illustrating how fragile gains could be. Still, Wyoming refused any rollback, proudly declaring that if forced to choose between statehood and women's suffrage, they would remain a territory forever. When Wyoming became a state in 1890, it kept women's voting rights intact, a symbolic victory that echoed nationwide. Meanwhile, suffrage slowly spread across western states. Colorado granted women the vote in 1893, after a statewide referendum, the first time men voluntarily voted to share political power with women. Idaho followed in 1896, creating a Western core of equality that suffragists praised as the shining example. This Western success inspired campaigns elsewhere. But while the West opened doors, many states in the East slammed them shut. Legislatures rejected bills repeatedly. Some mocked suffrage as dangerous, even immoral. Newspapers warned that giving women the vote would unbalance families and bring chaos to government. Yet activists learned a valuable lesson. State victories could build national momentum, one brick at a time. If enough states enfranchised women, Congress would eventually be pressured to ratify a constitutional amendment. The movement now had two strategies: federal demand and state-by-state campaigns, and though divided, they advanced on parallel tracks. At the same time, black women faced unique challenges in both suffrage organizations. Leaders like Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, and later Ida B. Wells and Mary Church Terrell insisted that the fight for women's voting rights must include women of color, who faced racial discrimination even among fellow activists. Sojourner Truth traveled across the country, speaking about abolition and women's rights. When asked if she was strong enough to vote, she famously flexed her arm and said she could work as hard as any man. Her speeches reminded audiences that oppression is never one-dimensional. The suffrage movement was powerful, but imperfect, and the voices of black women would continue pushing it toward true equality. By the late 1880s, suffrage was evolving from a scattered cause into a coordinated national force. Activists realized that persuasion alone would not win. They needed structure, discipline, and strategy. Leaders began collecting voter statistics, publishing pamphlets, lobbying lawmakers, and building networks across states. Organizations trained women to speak publicly, even though many cities still banned women from standing on political stages. In some places, police arrested women for distributing suffrage flyers. In others, mobs disrupted meetings, throwing eggs or stones. Still, activists returned again and again. They believed that every jeer, every closed door, every defeat was simply another step toward victory. Both NWSA and AWSA achieved valuable progress separately, but many recognized that unity was necessary for the final push. After 2 decades of rivalry, the two groups merged in 1890 to form the National American Woman Suffrage Association, NASA, with Susan B. Anthony and later Carrie Chapman Catt as key leaders. NASA adopted a focused, moderate strategy: polite lobbying, persuasion, and incremental change. They believed that winning states gradually would build undeniable pressure for a national amendment. Conventions expanded, membership increased, and suffrage became a kitchen table topic in households across America. Society was shifting. Women entered universities, became doctors, lawyers, and journalists. They worked in factories and offices, proving themselves capable beyond domestic walls. Yet despite progress, the ballot remained distant. Many politicians dismissed suffrage bills to avoid controversy. Some declared that women did not want the vote. Acclaimed suffragists answered with massive petition drives bearing hundreds of thousands of signatures. As the 19th century neared its end, Susan B. Anthony grew older but never slowed. She traveled tirelessly, speaking even when her voice weakened. At 80 years old, she addressed Congress, urging them to pass a women's suffrage amendment. She knew time was short. When she delivered her final public words, she said, "Failure is impossible." She died in 1906, 14 years before the 19th Amendment was ratified. She did not live to cast a ballot, yet her life carved the path others would follow. The movement now stood at a turning point. A new generation was rising, young, bold, strategic. They would march, picket the White House, go to jail, and hunger strike for the vote. The century would soon belong to them. As the 20th century approached, the American landscape was changing rapidly. Cities grew, factories hummed, and immigrants poured into the nation seeking opportunities. The progressive era brought reform energy. People challenged corruption, child labor, poor working conditions, and social inequality. This atmosphere provided fertile ground for women's suffrage to evolve into a mainstream political force. After the merger of the two rival suffrage groups into the National American Woman Suffrage Association, NASA, in 1890, the movement gained unity that had long been missing. Under leaders like Susan B. Anthony, Anna Howard Shaw, and later Carrie Chapman Catt, NASA built a powerful organizational machine. While Anthony represented the uncompromising spirit of the early movement, Catt represented a new generation, strategic, methodical, and politically sharp. Born in 1859, Catt worked as a teacher, principal, and even a school superintendent at a time when women rarely held such positions. She joined the suffrage movement in the 1880s, quickly rising in prominence due to her skill in organization and leadership. After Anthony's retirement, Cat became the face of NASA's national effort. Her approach was systematic rather than confrontational. She believed patience and persuasion could convince men that women's votes would strengthen the nation rather than destabilize it. Under Cat's guidance, NASA launched the Winning Plan, a dual strategy focusing on gaining suffrage state by state while simultaneously pressuring Congress for a federal amendment. This required massive infrastructure, local chapters, fundraising campaigns, public speeches, literature distribution, and petition drives. NASA became one of the largest women's organizations in American history, with hundreds of thousands of members. They held parades, conventions, debates, and rallies. They wrote to newspapers, lobbied lawmakers, and organized suffrage schools to train volunteers in public speaking, leadership, and campaign strategy. Women who once feared speaking in public now stood proudly on stages and courthouse steps, urging crowds to support equality. Many men attended these events, some supportive, others mocking. Yet even ridicule spread awareness. NASA also formed alliances with labor unions, clubs, and professional groups, arguing that women voters could improve education, public health, and social welfare. The movement tapped into progressive ideals. If women could vote, they could help clean up politics, protect children, regulate industries, and reduce corruption. Suffrage was no longer portrayed merely as a women's demand. It was framed as a national benefit. Still, challenges persisted. Many southern states opposed suffrage due to fears it would empower black women. Some congressional leaders refused to even discuss suffrage bills. Others claimed women had enough influence through their husbands. Anti-suffrage organizations formed, arguing that voting would take women away from their homes. Yet as the world modernized, their arguments sounded increasingly outdated. Women were already working in schools, stores, factories, hospitals, and newspapers. They paid taxes. They obeyed laws. Why should they not help shape them? The question grew louder each year. While NASA pushed a moderate path, building respectability and political persuasion, a new wave of younger activists emerged with more militant energy. They admired Anthony and Stanton, but believed polite lobbying was too slow. They watched as decades passed, and still Congress refused to act. Some activists wanted direct confrontation, mass protests, and unapologetic civil disobedience. This generational shift brought tension, but also power. Among the new voices were women like Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, leaders inspired by the British suffrage movement led by Emmeline Pankhurst. In Britain, women chained themselves to buildings, smashed windows, and went on hunger strikes. Paul and Burns brought radical tactics to America, not out of anger alone, but out of urgency. They respected NASA but believed the movement needed fire as well as diplomacy. However, before these militant tactics took center stage, NASA continued expanding across the nation. The early 1900s saw important victories. States like Washington, 1910, California, 1911, Arizona, Kansas, and Oregon, 1912, followed by New York, 1917, all granted women the vote. Each state victory became a banner of progress, proving the rising strength of the movement. Suffragists celebrated with parades where thousands marched wearing yellow roses, the symbol of equality. Cities buzzed with energy. Women on horseback led marches through crowded streets. Bands played suffrage songs. Children carried banners reading, "Votes for Mother." These images changed public perception. No longer were suffragists mocked as angry radicals. They appeared as patriotic, organized, determined citizens. NASA's campaigns used every available method. They printed pamphlets, designed posters, published newsletters, and made clever use of modern technology. The invention of the automobile allowed activists to travel long distances quickly, carrying suffrage literature from town to town. Motion pictures, a new industry, featured suffrage stories. Women held automobile tours, driving across multiple states with banners attached, stopping at farms, markets, and city halls to speak. They organized suffrage days at fairs and baseball games. Even suffrage buttons and pins became fashionable items, sparking conversation everywhere they appeared. Still, opposition remained intense. Anti-suffragists argued that women didn't want the vote, claiming most women were too busy with family to care about politics. They feared suffrage would lead to women abandoning domestic life. Some even warned it would destroy marriages. Anti-suffrage posters showed unhappy men cooking dinner while their wives voted. as if gender equality would flip the world upside down. Yet reality proved different. In states where women could vote, homes still functioned, families thrived, and no social collapse occurred. The arguments grew weaker as evidence mounted. Suffrage became increasingly mainstream, and NASA gained political influence. By 1915, suffrage had spread widely across the West, but many major eastern states still resisted. Cat, understanding timing was everything, prepared for a final nationwide push. While NASA's national strategy matured, Carrie Chapman Catt recognized a critical truth. To win a constitutional amendment, the movement had to prove women were indispensable to the nation. Opportunity arrived unexpectedly with the outbreak of World War I in 1914. As men left for battlefields in Europe, women stepped into roles previously closed to them. Factory work, engineering, transportation, government offices, medical service, agriculture, and military support. They produced weapons, built airplanes, drove ambulances, trained as nurses, and kept the economy functioning. The nation witnessed firsthand what suffragists had claimed for decades. Women were not fragile ornaments. They were capable citizens. The war highlighted inequality in stark contrast. Women served their country, yet could not vote for the leaders who sent them to war. Catt saw the moral power in this contradiction and used it to strengthen NASA's campaign. She urged members to support the war effort publicly, proving loyalty and patriotism. NASA volunteers worked for the Red Cross, organized Liberty Loan drives, and provided community aid. Their service earned respect, softening resistance among politicians and the public. Yet at the same time, the emerging militant faction led by Alice Paul pursued a different approach: public pressure through protest, picketing the White House, and hunger strikes. The friction between NASA's diplomacy and Paul's militancy would soon shape the climax of the movement. But before that clash fully developed, NASA's influence reached its peak. By 1917, with millions of women active in public life, support for enfranchisement surged. Even President Woodrow Wilson, initially indifferent, began to shift under pressure. The idea of democracy in wartime looked hypocritical while half the citizens lacked representation. Catt met with Wilson several times, presenting suffrage as inevitable and beneficial. She argued not only for justice, but for political advantage. Women voters could strengthen democracy after the war. Her reasoning appealed to lawmakers who feared radical protest but respected NASA's moderate discipline. As the movement gathered momentum, the nation approached a turning point. Decades of speeches, marches, petitions, arrests, and sacrifice were converging. The journey from Seneca Falls to the Progressive Era had been long, full of heartbreak and triumph. As new voices joined the cause, the movement gained diversity. Some focused on legal rights, others on moral reform, labor rights, or educational access. Though united in purpose, they often disagreed on tactics. Some believed persuasion and reason would slowly win societal approval, while others felt confrontation was necessary to shatter inequality. But despite disagreements, all shared a common belief: women deserved political representation. The 1850s saw the first national women's rights conventions, where activists like Lucy Stone, Sojourner Truth, and Ernestine Rose spoke with passion. Truth, a formerly enslaved woman, delivered her powerful "Ain't I a Woman" speech, confronting racism and sexism simultaneously. She reminded listeners that Black women worked, endured hardship, and deserved rights. Her voice added depth to a movement that still struggled at times to include women of color equally. Meanwhile, newspapers across America began discussing women's suffrage, some in support, others in outrage. Politicians could no longer ignore the question. The simple idea that women were equal human beings challenged centuries of law and tradition, and frightened many who benefited from the status quo. But the seed had taken root. The Declaration of Sentiments became a blueprint. Seneca Falls transformed personal frustration into political struggle. Women who had been silent began to speak. Those who had been obedient began to question. Each lecture, petition, and resolution expanded the movement's reach. Though victory was far away, the path had been opened. Ahead lay the Civil War, divisions within the movement, battles over the 14th and 15th Amendments, the rise of Susan B. Anthony and Stanton as national leaders, and the eventual creation of powerful suffrage organizations. Seneca Falls had set history in motion, and there would be no turning back. After the spark ignited at Seneca Falls, the movement needed structure, consistency, and relentless energy. That driving force arrived in Susan B. Anthony, a woman whose name would become inseparable from suffrage itself. Born in 1820 to a Quaker family that valued education and social reform, Anthony grew up believing that injustice demanded action, not silence. She became a schoolteacher, discovering firsthand that women earned far less than men, often one-third or even one-fourth of a male salary. This inequality enraged her, planting in her mind the idea that independence was impossible without power. When she met Elizabeth Cady Stanton in 1851, it was a historic moment, the meeting of intellect and action. Stanton was a brilliant writer and theorist, a mastermind at crafting speeches and documents. Anthony was a strategist, organizer, traveler, fundraiser, a tireless engine. Together, they formed a partnership that lasted half a century. Stanton later wrote that Anthony was the general of the movement, while she was the brains. Their roles complemented each other like two halves of the same body. Anthony traveled for months at a time across cold Midwest winters, mud-soaked roads, or crowded cities, speaking anywhere people would listen: schoolhouses, churches, barns, even outdoor fields. She endured hecklers, jeers, and hostility. Men sometimes blocked entrances, while others laughed loudly to drown her voice. Newspapers mocked her stern appearance, calling her unfeminine because she spoke publicly and refused to live quietly. But Anthony never intended to fit society's expectations. She believed freedom required discomfort. Every insult only strengthened her resolve. Together, Stanton and Anthony founded the Women's State Temperance Society, then moved fully into suffrage. They produced petitions demanding women's right to vote and property rights reform. They collected signatures, sometimes walking door to door in snowstorms, persuading farmers, laborers, and housewives to sign. Many slammed doors in their faces. Others whispered support, but were too afraid to publicly align themselves. Yet slowly, names filled pages. Anthony began lobbying state legislatures, often standing before all-male assemblies who smirked as she spoke. She learned parliamentary rules, mastered debate, and refused to be dismissed. Even those who opposed her admitted her determination was astonishing. "Failure is impossible," she famously declared, not as a boast, but as a vow. Meanwhile, Stanton continued writing speeches in the newspaper The Revolution, which boldly printed controversial lines such as "Men, their rights, and nothing more. Women, their rights, and nothing less." These words shocked polite society, but they drew attention, and attention was power. The movement was no longer a whisper. It was a voice rising. As activism spread, so too did resistance. Many Americans feared that women voting would disrupt family life and moral order. Politicians argued that women were too emotional for politics. Religious leaders preached that God designed women to obey. Newspapers caricatured suffragists as angry spinsters who hated men. Even many women opposed the idea, believing voting would thrust them into a dirty world they preferred to avoid. Society had trained women to think their place was the home, and change to that belief was slow, painful, and controversial. Yet Anthony and Stanton refused fear. They believed the ballot was the foundation of all rights. Without it, women could not control wages, property, divorce laws, or education. Their strategy was simple but ambitious. If the law denied women power, then women must change the law. This meant approaching legislatures repeatedly, petitioning Congress, and organizing conventions in major cities like Syracuse, Cleveland, and Boston. After the trial, Anthony and Stanton intensified their push for a constitutional amendment. They lobbied Congress every year, delivering petitions with thousands of signatures. But victory remained distant. Generations would pass, organizations would merge, strategies evolve, and new faces rise. Carrie Chapman Catt, Alice Paul, Ida B. Wells, Anna Howard Shaw, each building upon the foundation Stanton and Anthony laid. Yet in the 1870s and 1880s, the path forward was steep. Many states rejected women's suffrage repeatedly. Public ridicule continued. Still, perseverance grew. Western territories like Wyoming and Utah granted women voting rights earlier than the East, offering proof that society would not collapse if women voted. The movement began to shift from idealistic beginnings to organized political force. The seeds from Seneca Falls had sprouted into a resilient tree rooted in activism, sacrifice, and unity through hardship. The nation was not ready to grant women full citizenship. Not yet, but change was coming. Susan B. Anthony would never live to see the victory she devoted her life to. but her struggle was the heartbeat of the movement. And as she traveled from town to town, speaking until her voice rasped and her body tired, she carried with her an unshakable truth. One day the nation would listen. One day, women would vote. As the Civil War ended in 1865, America entered a turbulent era known as Reconstruction, a time filled with hope, conflict, and political transformation. The abolition of slavery demanded new amendments to define citizenship and voting rights. Women suffragists believed their moment had finally arrived, expecting recognition for decades of work supporting abolition. Yet as Congress crafted the 14th and 15th Amendments, a painful truth surfaced. The nation was prepared to enfranchise formerly enslaved men, but not women of any race. For the first time, the Constitution used the word male, defining voters as men. To many women, including Stanton and Anthony, this was not progress, it was betrayal. They had campaigned alongside abolitionists, faced violence for speaking against slavery, and now watched the political door shut in their faces. They asked, how could a democratic nation extend rights to one oppressed group while refusing them to another? The answer lay in political priorities. Lawmakers feared expanding suffrage too broadly, believing women's inclusion would destabilize politics. Women, they argued, were represented by their husbands. But suffragists countered fiercely. How could representation exist without consent? Could freedom truly include only half the population? These debates split friendships, alliances, and organizations. The fracture became official in 1869. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony formed the National Woman Suffrage Association, NWSA, focusing on a federal amendment granting universal women's suffrage and addressing broader women's rights, including divorce reform, property rights, and equality in law. They believed the Constitution itself must change. Meanwhile, Lucy Stone, Henry Blackwell, and their allies formed the American Woman Suffrage Association, AWSA, choosing a more moderate approach, support the 15th Amendment for black men, and work for women's voting state by state. They feared opposing the 15th Amendment would harm the moral credibility of the movement. Thus, two organizations emerged, one radical in tone, demanding immediate equality, the other pragmatic, patient, and incremental. Many newspapers and politicians delighted in this division, believing internal conflict would slow progress. And it did. For years, NWSA and AWSA held separate conventions, ran separate campaigns, and even criticized each other's strategies. Yet underneath the rivalry lay a shared dream: citizenship, dignity, and the ballot. As NASA continued to push for suffrage through a calculated and patient strategy, another force emerged, sharper, younger, fueled by impatience. After decades of polite persuasion with limited results, many felt the movement needed a spark, something bold enough to shake the nation. That spark arrived in the form of Alice Paul, a brilliant strategist trained in law and political activism. Born in 1885 to a Quaker family, she grew up believing men and women were equals. In her 20s, she traveled to England and witnessed the suffrage struggle unlike anything in America. British suffragettes led by Emmeline Pankhurst chained themselves to buildings, broke windows, disrupted political meetings, and were arrested repeatedly. Their tactics were controversial, but effective. They captured the world's attention. Alice Paul learned firsthand that power rarely yields to quiet requests. Upon her return to the United States in 1910, she brought a new style of suffrage politics: militant, public, uncompromising. She quickly joined NASA, but soon clashed with leaders like Carrie Chapman Catt. Paul was not content with slow state campaigns. She wanted a federal amendment immediately. To her, waiting meant injustice prolonged. She believed pressured spectacle could move Congress faster than decades of lobbying. While NASA valued respectability to win reluctant voters, Paul believed public disruption could expose government hypocrisy. America claimed to be a democracy, while half of its people could not vote. Paul, alongside Lucy Burns and other like-minded activists, formed the Congressional Union for Woman Suffrage, later renamed the National Woman's Party, NWP. Their mission was singular and laser-focused: pass a federal suffrage amendment through direct confrontation and political pressure. NASA and the NWP shared the same goal, but followed different roads. Tensions rose as the NWP challenged the more cautious approach of NASA. Critics warned Paul's methods risked backlash, but she argued that rights are never won by waiting politely. In 1913, The NWP organized a massive milestone event, the Women's Suffrage Parade in Washington, D.C., strategically scheduled one day before President Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. Tens of thousands attended, lining Pennsylvania Avenue as 5,000 women marched in white dresses, carrying banners demanding the vote. The spectacle was stunning: women marching, riding horses, bands playing, state delegations walking proudly. Yet not everyone approved. Angry crowds of men, some intoxicated, attacked marchers, jeering, pushing, spitting, grabbing, and hurling insults. Police failed to protect the women. Some even joined in the harassment. Over 100 suffragists were hospitalized. Instead of damaging the cause, the violence shocked the nation. Newspapers printed photos of injured women, and Americans saw suffragists not as radicals, but as women fighting peacefully against hostility. The parade became a turning point. America could no longer ignore the movement. After the parade, Alice Paul intensified her efforts. She understood that constant visibility maintained pressure. The NWP held rallies outside Congress, distributed pamphlets across cities, and organized automobile tours that traveled state to state with suffrage banners streaming behind. They published newspapers, produced posters, and crafted political messages that cut deep. Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? Their activism became even more daring in 1917 when they began picketing the White House, the first group in U.S. history to do so. 6 days a week, through snow, heat, and rain, women stood holding large banners demanding suffrage. The press named them the Silent Sentinels, dignified, still, unmovable. At first, crowds watched with curiosity, but soon opposition grew. Critics accused them of unpatriotic behavior, especially as World War I escalated. Some claimed protesting during wartime was treasonous. But Paul understood that wartime was the perfect moment to reveal injustice. Women served the nation, yet were denied a voice within it. President Wilson tried to ignore the pickets, hoping they would fade. Instead, they multiplied. Banners became bolder, sometimes directly addressing Wilson with quotes comparing him to oppressive rulers abroad. Eventually, police began arresting protesters on charges like obstructing traffic, even though they stood peacefully on sidewalks. Instead of backing down, suffragists returned after every arrest. More women arrived, more banners unfurled. Soon jails filled with arrested suffragists. Among them were well-educated women, professionals, mothers, even elderly activists. The government expected imprisonment to deter protest. It had the opposite effect. Wealthy and respected women being dragged into police wagons drew national outrage. Headlines spread everywhere. The public asked, why imprison women for wanting democracy? Conditions in prison were brutal. Suffragists at the Occoquan workhouse were fed contaminated food, forced into filthy uniforms, and made to perform hard labor. Guards punished those who resisted. Some prisoners organized hunger strikes. Alice Paul herself was arrested, placed in solitary confinement, and was force-fed raw eggs through a tube when she refused to eat. Doctors and prison officials hoped to break her resolve, but instead her endurance fueled the movement. News of the hunger strikes shocked Americans. Stories of women being restrained, tubes forced down their throats, made the government look cruel and suffrage appear righteous. Even those previously neutral began sympathizing. Politicians grew uneasy. Wilson, fearing growing backlash, finally softened. In 1918, he publicly endorsed women's suffrage, calling it a necessary warm measure. This was a huge shift. A sitting president now supported the cause. Yet endorsement alone was not enough. The amendment still needed to pass Congress, and opposition remained strong. The suffragists intensified their campaign. The NWP continued picketing and hunger strikes. NASA increased lobbying and state campaigns. Both sides of the movement, militant pressure and strategic diplomacy, formed a powerful two-front attack. Like two hands pushing the same door, they strained from different angles, but toward one goal. The nation was nearing breakthrough. As 1918 and 1919 unfolded, suffrage became one of the most debated issues in Congress. Speeches thundered in the House and Senate. Some lawmakers argued women deserved rights as equal citizens. Others claimed politics would corrupt women or that women would abandon families. Yet the war had changed public perception dramatically. Women worked in factories beside men, drove ambulances on European battlefields, and nursed wounded soldiers under fire. Their contributions disproved every argument about fragility or incapacity. When the influenza pandemic struck, women served as frontline caregivers, risking their lives to protect their communities. Suffrage activists used these realities in powerful campaigns, asking, how can a nation call itself free while denying rights to those who sustain it? In January 1918, the House of Representatives finally passed the Women's Suffrage Amendment, but only by the minimum number of votes required. It then moved to the Senate, where Southern opposition created a blockade. The Senate vote fell short, a heartbreaking defeat after decades of work. But suffragists did not surrender. They rallied, marched, lobbied, and wrote relentlessly. The NWP continued picketing, sometimes burning speeches of the president as symbolic protest. NASA mobilized voters in states where women already had partial suffrage, pressuring senators through their constituents. The amendment returned to Senate floor in June 1919, and this time, by just 2 votes, it passed. The gallery exploded with cheers and tears. Alice Paul raised a purple, white, and gold suffrage flag from party headquarters. Carrie Chapman Catt announced victory was close, but one final obstacle remained: ratification by 36 states. The nation turned into a battlefield of persuasion. Suffragists traveled everywhere, convincing governors, legislators, community leaders. Anti-suffragists responded fiercely, claiming society would be destroyed if women voted. Some states ratified quickly: Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan. Others rejected repeatedly. The fate of the amendment would come down to one state, Tennessee, in 1920. By 1919, the amendment that generations of suffragists had fought for finally cleared Congress. The text was simple, but history-changing. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Now began the last great trial. The amendment required ratification by 36 of the 48 states, a process that would become a political war unlike anything the suffrage movement had faced before. Suffragists knew the opposition would not surrender quietly. The National American Woman Suffrage Association, NASA, mobilized thousands. The National Woman's Party, NWP, intensified pressure through protests and political strategy. The entire nation turned into a chessboard. States in the West, where women already voted, ratified quickly. The Midwest followed with growing momentum. But Southern states resisted fiercely, claiming suffrage threatened social order, particularly racial hierarchy. Some politicians argued women would double the black vote, which segregationists feared deeply. Money flowed behind the scenes from anti-suffrage groups, liquor industries, and conservative organizations who believed women voters would push for prohibition and moral reform. For every state gained, another slipped away. By summer 1920, 35 states ratified, just one short of the required 36. Every remaining unratified state was openly hostile, except one battleground, Tennessee. The future of women's voting rights would hinge on Nashville. The city transformed into a political arena. Suffragists arrived wearing yellow roses, the symbol of the movement. Anti-suffragists, calling themselves antis, wore red roses. Legislators walked through hallways like players in a drama, coats adorned with either red or yellow blossoms. Newspapers called it the War of the Roses. The Hermitage Hotel became the headquarters of persuasion. Every room, lobby, staircase, and dining hall buzzed with arguments, debates, whispered deals, and lobbying that stretched late into the night. Some lawmakers were undecided, pulled between tradition and progress, family expectations, and public pressure. Suffragists appealed to patriotism, fairness, and democracy. Antis warned that women voting would end traditional families and disrupt society. Both sides held rallies, speeches, and meetings. Legislators sometimes hid to avoid lobbyists. Attempts were made to delay the vote indefinitely. There were rumors of bribes, threats, and political trade-offs. Some lawmakers changed their stance multiple times within hours. Carrie Chapman Catt herself traveled to Nashville, operating from her hotel room, reading reports, planning strategy, encouraging volunteers, and writing endlessly. She had led decades of careful organization. Now it came down to this moment. Alice Paul waited anxiously in Washington, sewing an additional star on the suffrage flag for each state that ratified. She left one spot empty, waiting for Tennessee. The movement held its breath. On the morning of August 18, 1920, the Tennessee House convened in a charged atmosphere. Spectators filled every seat. Reporters stood pressed against walls, pencils ready to record history. Some lawmakers entered wearing red roses, a sign they opposed ratification. Others wore yellow. A few wore none, hiding their positions like concealed weapons. The first votes were procedural, but every decision mattered. Antis believed they had the numbers to block the amendment. Suffragists prayed for even one unexpected shift. The room heated with tension. Speeches began, emotional, fierce, at times bitter. Some men argued passionately for wives, daughters, and mothers who deserved rights. Others thundered that suffrage would ruin the South. Shouts rose, applause erupted, and the speaker's gavel pounded to restore order. When the roll call for ratification began, hearts pounded across the chamber. Names were called one by one. Yellow votes sparked hope. Red votes sparked despair. The tally was razor thin, swinging back and forth like a pendulum. Observers later recalled it felt as if the room held its breath after each name. Then came a young legislator hardly noticed before, 24-year-old Harry T. Byrne, wearing a red rose. Everyone expected him to vote. No, the suffrage cause seemed doomed. But in his pocket lay something no one could see. A letter from his mother, Feb Insminger Byrne, who wrote urging him to support ratification. She believed women deserved the vote, and she asked her son to do the right thing. When Harry Byrne's name echoed across the hall, he shocked everyone with a clear, steady eye. Gasps filled the chamber. The red rose on his lapel could not stop his conscience. That single decision changed the vote. Within moments, Tennessee became the 36th state. The chamber erupted in chaos. Shouts, cheers, fury, disbelief. Some antis attempted to overturn the decision through parliamentary maneuvers, but they failed. Suffrage supporters burst into tears, embraced strangers, and ran to telegraph offices to share the news nationwide. Outside, crowds celebrated as church bells rang. Women had waited 72 years for this moment. From Seneca Falls to the jail cells of Occoquan, from dusty petition tables to White House picket lines. One mother's letter and one courageous vote became the final spark that ignited victory. In Washington, Alice Paul calmly walked to her office where the suffrage flag hung proudly with 35 stars. With deliberate care, she stitched the 36th star, completing the circle of states. Others were not calm. Suffragists across the country wept, laughed, prayed, shouted in the streets. Telegrams poured in like a river of joy. Carrie Chapman Catt, exhausted beyond measure, cried softly in her hotel room, knowing generations of women had lived without this right, and future generations would never know such exclusion. Days later, on August 26, 1920, the 19th Amendment was officially certified into the U.S. Constitution, and American women finally won the right to vote. Newspapers printed headlines in bold type, "Women win ballot. Democracy expands. History remade." Yet the moment was more than ink on paper. It represented the culmination of lifetimes of sacrifice. Susan B. Anthony had died 14 years earlier, never casting a ballot. Elizabeth Cady Stanton passed in 1902, dreaming of the victory she did not see. Sojourner Truth, Lucy Stone, Ida B. Wells, Anna Howard Shaw. Countless pioneers never saw the result of battles they began. Their footsteps echoed in every polling booth that opened to women that year. The first election after ratification was a symbolic chapter turn. Women walked into polling places with heads high, some elderly and frail, but determined to vote if it was the last thing they did. Newspapers captured images of grandmothers casting their very first ballots, smiling with pride, often escorted by daughters and granddaughters. It was emotional, almost sacred. America could not return to a world where women were voiceless in law. Yet victory was not the end of struggle, rather, a new beginning. Although the 19th Amendment banned voting discrimination on the basis of sex, many black women in the South still faced Jim Crow laws, poll taxes, literacy tests, and racist intimidation preventing them from voting for decades more. Native American women were often excluded because they were not considered citizens until 1924. Asian American women faced barriers due to restrictive immigration and citizenship laws. Puerto Rican women gained partial suffrage only later. The fight for voting equality did not end in 1920. It evolved, but the 19th Amendment cracked open the political system and permanently shifted American democracy. It empowered women to run for office, fight for workers' rights, champion children's welfare, and shape laws from within. Millions of voices entered the public arena, making the nation more inclusive, responsive, and just. The suffrage struggle became proof that democracy is not given. It is demanded, defended, and sustained by those brave enough to challenge power. The victory in Tennessee was more than a political win. It was a human story of mothers and daughters, sacrifice and courage, letters and hunger strikes, hope and heartbreak. It marked the end of one battle and the dawn of another, ensuring women's voices would never again be silenced. The torch had passed to a new generation who would continue the fight for equality beyond the ballot, in workplaces, schools, government, and every corner of society.